Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, and you're listening to Tech Mirror, a podcast that talks about how humans shape technology and how technology is shaping our society. Hello, listeners. Today we have a special guest with us here in the studio, His Excellency Brendan Dowling, Australia's Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. Brendan, welcome to Tech Mirror.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really exciting to have you here. We're going to start at the start, which is, what on earth does a cyber ambassador do? I think most people are pretty familiar with the role of an ambassador, but maybe not in the context of the portfolio that you hold. So what relationships and alliances and partnerships do you focus on in your role?
Sure. So you're right. I think we all have a good understanding of a traditional geographically based ambassador. Explaining to my mum what this role involves has been particularly challenging. But essentially it's a similar type of role, except that I'm based out of Canberra. So it's about advocating for our national interests with the global tech marketplace, with our partners and allies, and for those we have slightly more tetchy relationships with, and also working in the multilateral system for Australia's interests. So rather than being based in a different country, it's based on a plane, travelling all around the world, trying to shape how technology is developed, deployed, what the cyber domain looks like for us, and ensuring that our interests are prosecuted.
And when we say Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology, what's the framing? Like, what issues are in scope and out of scope? Because I think some people hear Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and they think you're an ambassador into like the metaverse or something, which is very much not what the role is.
Yes.
So what are the issues that fit within that definition?
Sure. And I think when you talk cyber affairs, as you know, this is terminology that is not super well defined, which is difficult in some respects, but also gives you a lot of latitude to move. In a practical sense, what I spend and what my team spends our day-to-day time on are a few key things. So firstly, we do a lot of work in Southeast Asia and the Pacific in helping to build up their cyber resilience. That means that I spend a lot of time talking to countries, talking about the model that Australia has applied and why we think we've got some lessons to share in how you better protect your critical infrastructure, your government systems, your private sector. We fund a lot of projects in the region. So we do a lot of work in the Pacific in terms of building capacity, training, awareness raising, legal frameworks, actual hardware and software. And then we also spend a lot of time in the multilateral system, shaping the rules which govern behaviour in cyberspace. That goes to cybercrime and how we prosecute cyber criminals who are nearly always operating across borders. It also goes to the norms of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, with which you are very familiar, in ensuring that the cyberspace is not ungoverned, that we do operate according to a set of principles. Another element of our work is what I broadly call deterrence work, which is about how we say that when we set those rules, we're actually holding other countries to account, other actors to account. That means applying sanctions where it's in our interest to do so. It means calling out behaviour that cuts across the established norms, what we call attributions, and generally being a big advocate within the Australian government system about what a good, responsible actor Australia should be in global cyberspace.
I obviously am biased. For those of you who don't know, I used to work within Brendan's portfolio before Brendan was the cyber ambassador, though. I think it's such a fascinating area in the sense that we know that states are exerting so much power and influence through cyberspace or through technology. And, you know, I really see the role that you have as such a pivotal role in ensuring that Australia's interests are protected in that exertion of power and influence. Speaking of power and influence, and you mentioned their attribution, I think the thing that prompted me to invite you to come onto the podcast was the public attribution by Australia and others of state-sponsored cyber activity to China, which happened last month. And that was a public advisory that was issued that said there was a threat to Australian networks. So perhaps can you talk us through first what the advisory actually was? What is the threat? And then maybe we can talk about how we get to a point where Australia makes a decision to make that type of public attribution.
Yeah, sure. So the specifics of the threat are about a APT group, an Advanced Persistent Threat Actor known as APT-40, which is a group we assess to be operating under the auspices of the Chinese government. And it is a group that we have detected doing widespread targeting of Australian government, private infrastructure, taking advantage of known vulnerabilities oftentimes and looking to exploit whether it's information gathering, whether it's the theft of data, basically accessing a large range of systems in Australia and also elsewhere in the world to take advantage of systems that we consider valuable to our national interest and get in there and access information. So the advisory really goes to exposing this is the type of behaviour that we're seeing. It is pervasive. It is happening today. It has been happening. It will continue to happen. Most of the networks that are being exploited by this threat actor are operated by people outside of government who are not inside the SCIFs, who are not looking at classified material. So it's super important that we get this information out in an unclassified way to say, here is the behaviour that we're seeing and here are the mitigations to help close some of the holes through which this threat actor is getting through. So it's really about getting technical information out there that allows people to mitigate the threat that we know is happening on a day-to-day basis.
Mm. So there's the motivation of having the holes plugged effectively to draw people's attention to the fact that there's these vulnerabilities in the networks.
Yep.
What is the decision-making process that goes on? You know, making an attribution like this to China is a consequential decision.
Yes.
Can you, to the extent that you're able to, talk people through what the decision-making process is around that?
Yeah, it is a complicated and it's a long decision which takes into account the technical level, and we need to be confident that when we put out this type of information, it is rock solid, that we know that this is happening, we know what the behaviours are, that we've tested, verified, validated, and that work is done by our friends at the Australian Signals Directorate. But then there's a lot of other considerations. What is the purpose of getting this information out there? What are the downsides? And obviously, when we attribute to a nation state, there is some blowback, there is some criticism that we have publicly attributed this type of behaviour. For me, it really comes back to what is the value of an attribution. Now, we have established principles about where we consider the lines of responsible state behaviour to be. As a general rule, I think there is no value to establishing those lines if, when we see them cross, we all just sit back and do nothing and say nothing. So if we believe in those principles, in those norms, then we have to stand up and say, we consider this behaviour to be unacceptable. More importantly, with this specific advisory, as I said, the information is relevant to network defenders outside of government in a range of sectors. Unless we put that information out there, it's really difficult for your network defenders working, say, in the telecommunications industry to know that this is crucial information, that they're being targeted and they should do something about it. Why do we need to name a nation state as part of that? For me, it's about the seriousness of the threat. So if you just generally put out a technical advisory which has nothing but technical information, that sort of stuff lands on people's desks. You know, there's tens of them every day. This stuff is firing around the cybersecurity world all the time. When the Australian government issues a formal advisory, co-badged with several other governments, which names China as the actor behind it, that goes straight to the top of everyone's pile. It goes straight to the top, not just of the technical community, but also boards, CEOs who pay attention to it. So for me, the attribution here has value in expressing the seriousness of this, the pervasiveness of it, and getting people to pay attention. It also says to the threat actor, we know what you're doing. It throws sand in the works in terms of if they're going to try and continue their activity, they need to look at the tradecraft that they are using. So I think it has value in exposing and making the threat actor's life more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your point about drawing attention to it is so important, particularly because with this advisory that they were known vulnerabilities, right? So
Yes.
that advice has landed on people's desks and it's been added to the pile and it's saying, no, you actually need to pay attention.
And you can do something about it. The technical information is there. It can be followed. This is not what can we do? There's some very clear steps people can take to address it.
Yeah. For listeners who don't have the background, the policy of public attribution is still relatively new. So
Yes.
until 2017, if things like this were happening, we basically said Australia doesn't comment on intelligence matters if people asked us publicly. And from 2017, we progressively started making public attributions. And what is really interesting to me, looking at the way that Australia publicly attributes, and we've now attributed to China several times. It was interesting to me that there was media reporting that this was the first time, but we have previously
yes.
attributed, including Chinese compromises of managed service providers, for example, but also to Iran, DPRK and Russia. When you look at the way that attributions are made, when we first made the attributions, it was a very small group, largely Five Eyes. It has increasingly got the attributions being made in partnership with other like-minded countries. So what's the value of making these types of attribution statements in the company of other countries?
I think it increases the resonance throughout the world. So having more agencies, more countries standing behind it and say, yes, we also agree this is serious. We stand with Australia in calling out this behaviour. That means the audience is broader. So you get the US companies interested, you get the Europeans interested. It also is always smart in international relations to do things in good company, a phrase that we often use in the UN, because it means that you can't be picked off. You can't say, well, that's an Australian thing. We're going to, if there's any blowback, it'll be targeted at Australia. We say, no, we're standing in solidarity with a broader range of countries. So I think it increases the power of that. The big difference for us with this advisory was that we had Japan and Korea come on board. It's not the first time that those countries have done advisories and attributions. It's the first time they've done it with us, and they do it very rarely. It was a big deal to have them on board. The reason it's a big deal is because it shows countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, throughout Asia, that this is not just a Western-led Five Eyes campaign. This is something that is super relevant to them. So I think it increases the resonance throughout our region. When we've done attributions in the past, it will frequently be presented by the Chinese government as, well, Australia's just kowtowing to the US. Australia's just following a US agenda here. This one was Australian-led. It had partners from the region. And so I think that's a really powerful message for the region and to China to say it is not just us, it's not just the US or the UK. There's actually partners in the region who are also concerned about this threat activity.
And I think it's such a good example too for listeners who are sort of scratching their head saying, what does a cyber ambassador do in terms of the amount of work that goes on in the background to build those types of partnerships and trusts with perhaps unconventional partners or conventional partners in other spaces, but that we haven't yet had this type of work on. So certainly as a very close watcher of these things, I was cheering when I saw that ROC and Japan had come on board. So congratulations on getting that across the line. I think another area where we've seen real progress over the last year or so has been around autonomous sanctions and Australia's announcement of cyber sanctions and then the first uses of those cyber sanctions. Many people will know the concept of a sanction applied against a country or an individual. In the context of cyber sanctions, what are they? What's their purpose?
Yeah. I think the starting point is cybercrime is getting worse. It is an incredibly lucrative industry. It's an industry that has evolved to become extraordinarily sophisticated in ways that I think maybe none of us quite expected if you go back 5 years or more. You look at things like the ransomware as a service model. This is operating, obviously, run by criminal gangs, criminal elements, but you could make contact, you can procure the services, there's a help desk to guide you through it, they'll fence the data for you in dark web forums. it's an incredibly sophisticated industry, which increasingly is preying on the most vulnerable. So we're seeing childcare centres and governments and schools in the Pacific being targeted by cyber criminals, frequently operating out of permissive jurisdictions like Russia, but not only. So we can see that the problem's getting worse. The money is incredibly attractive for cyber criminals. We know that the DPRK uses this very effectively to steal money in cryptocurrency to fund their ballistic missiles program. So I think the broader context is we are seriously worried about the trends in cybercrime. We're seriously worried about the ransomware threat to Australia, but we're increasingly worried about how pervasive it is in the region, in countries that are less well equipped to defend themselves and to bounce back from this type of incident. So our starting point is we need to do something, and this is a problem that will get worse unless we start to squeeze the space in which cyber criminals are operating in. Law enforcement is key, where we can work towards prosecutions, where we can see people being arrested. That is a good outcome. This is heinous criminal activity. We want to see that happen. Unfortunately, that's exceptionally difficult. In spite of all the best efforts, there's a lot of technical work that goes into identifying the perpetrators behind a cybercrime attack. But when you do, if they're operating out of a jurisdiction where we don't have law enforcement cooperation that's very responsive, Russia's an example here, then our law enforcement tools are relatively limited. Disruption is really useful. Earlier in the year, we saw the disruption of the Lockbit network. That means basically taking down the websites that they use, targeting the infrastructure that they use, and stopping them from using it. That's really useful to be able to do that. Sanctions are the other key part of our toolkit. Sanctions essentially say, we have named this person, it is now illegal to deal with financial assets relating to this person. So if they have assets in Australia, then those are effectively frozen. Ransoms can't be paid to this person. They can't travel to Australia. We do that in partnership with others. So with the use of our cyber sanctions, we've done it in partnership with the US and the UK. Obviously, with the US being the linchpin of the global financial system, it becomes exponentially more effective when you involve a partner like that. But essentially, that is saying you are now on a public list. We've exposed your activities, which is deeply embarrassing to your average cyber criminal. But we've also limited the way anyone can deal with your financial assets. And it's essentially about saying, let's try and break the business model. Let's make it much more difficult for you to conduct your cybercrime business. It's not the only tool, but we think it is a pretty effective tool, not least because you are effectively doxed in the context of a cyber sanction. And once you're doxed, you are toxic in your own sort of cyber criminal community as well. So it's one tool. It doesn't solve the problem, but it is a really crucial tool.
Mm. And so in May, Australia used the sanctions regime to sanction a Russian individual. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that being effective? I think one of the things that I so often get pushback when I talk about cyber sanctions is people say, well, but that's just one person. How is that effective? And what do you respond to that?
Look, I think, as I said, it's only one tool. So let's not pretend that by levying a sanction on one individual that you suddenly solve the cybercrime problem. But it does affect that person's ability to operate their business. It does affect the ability of ransoms to be paid to that person. So I think it has a real meaningful effect on that individual's ability to do their business. I think anonymity is key to operate as a cyber criminal. As soon as you're not anonymous, you become a liability, because we do see from time to time in Russia some law enforcement actions taken against people who essentially sort of embarrass themselves, their state, by being exposed. So I think there is a personal cost to the individual. It makes it much more difficult for them to operate. Does it end their ability to operate? Not necessarily, but I do think it is a deterrent. And I do think it might seem that affecting someone's ability to travel to Australia, people might think, well, is your average cyber criminal coming on a holiday to the Gold Coast? Not necessarily, but it affects their ability to leave the country. Now, most people want to leave their country, and when they know they are the target of internationally coordinated law enforcement action, it becomes very difficult for you to live a life entirely normally. So I think There are cyber criminal actors for whom this is a genuine deterrent, but it's always going to be only one element of our arsenal. When we target a person like we did around Lockbit in May, that's not the end of the story. The law enforcement work is continuing. We will continue to go after more people. So you see individuals being hit by sanctions. There'll be more of them to come.
I used to engage a lot with foreign governments when I was working at the UN on these issues, and two things jump out to me. One is how vigorously countries like DPRK, Russia, Iran, less so China actually, push back on the concept of sanctions, which indicates that they obviously have some impact if they're getting that kind of response. But also the conversations that I had privately, sort of in the margins, quiet conversations with people from those countries who expressed concern about how they were being used and would make kind of offhanded jokes. Oh, I don't want to appear on one of your lists. I don't want my... And it's actually the travel that is the issue that was most often raised because people want the ability to be able to move around and through the countries. So I think, anecdotally for me, that is evidence that the sanctions are in people's mind and do have an impact. So I think it's important. You're listening to Tech Mirror, a podcast from the Australian National University's Tech Policy Design Centre. If you like what you're hearing, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating or, even better, leave us a short review on your podcast platform of choice. Now, enough interruptions from me. Let's dive back into this episode. Now, Brendan, we're sitting here just a few days after the CrowdStrike tech outage. So it would be remiss of me not to talk about CrowdStrike. What are the lessons that we can take from that in terms of international cooperation and, how do we prevent this type of thing from happening again? Is it possible to prevent it happening again? How do we prioritise responses to something like this?
I think it's an incredibly interesting incident, which as exactly what happened, we're starting to get more of a sense of that now. I think we'll continue to get more of a sense. So there will be a lot of lessons to learn from it. A few kind of strike me in the immediate aftermath. One is it just underscores how interconnected everything we do is, that we are reliant on a relatively small number of companies operating software that is in everything that we do. So when there is an incident, when there is, in this case, a technical incident, but in other cases, it will be a cyber attack, instant effect globally. I think we all know that we are an interconnected world, but this demonstrates just how real that is. It demonstrates that we are reliant on a very small number of major software enterprises. In this case, there's a CrowdStrike outage, but manifested through Microsoft. Microsoft is global critical infrastructure. It underpins everything that we do, which means when there is a failing like this, the ramifications throughout the world, throughout the economy are massive. So I think it exposes the concentration risk, which is a real one. I think the Cyber Safety Review Board, when it did its report into Microsoft's failings in its cloud security earlier in the year, made the point that Microsoft is global critical infrastructure. So I think it exposes that we do have global risks due to massive concentration of a small number of software providers. I think it also exposes that software companies most of the time are trying to do the right thing. It is not good for business when you have a failure like this, but we're essentially leaving it up to them. If CrowdStrike, the testing regime it develops and which failed in this instance to deploy these updates, is up to them to design it for themselves. And how much testing, how much validation they do is up to them to design it for themselves. When you can have such massive ramifications for the whole world, I think it does beg the question, is the sort of loosely governed world of enterprise software, is that good for the world? Is that the lack of any direct liability for software failings, is that good for the world? I think these are really tricky policy questions, but I think it does show that we are essentially putting the fates of our economic prosperity, our national security in the hands of private sector operators who are not subject to huge amounts of regulation and governance. I think no one wants to overregulate. I get that. But I think this is an arena where actually it feels like it's underregulated. I think there'll be class actions, other lawsuits, which will expose, I think, where responsibility lies and where the cost is borne. Those will be really interesting to see play out. But for me, it really just underscores that the technical world is not the technical world. It is a national security world. It is a foreign policy world. It is a regional and global resilience world. So we all need to pay more attention to this stuff outside of the technical community, outside of the sort of circles you and I operate in, because when stuff goes bad, it affects everything. The final point I'd make is if this can happen with a technical failure, it can also happen with a cyber attack. For me, there was reflections of the SolarWinds attack to say, well, can we get into the supply chain to then filter up through globally available infrastructure? I think this is the type of thing that a threat actor could exploit in a similar way, and we all need to be prepared for that. This was bad. It was really bad. This is a precursor of what the worst case scenario could be, and it feels to me that we don't have enough tests, validation buffers for when that happens.
Yeah. I think there's so much in what you just said there, Brendan. First of all, I think it's fascinating in CrowdStrike's public responses that they're referring to this as a defect caused by updates in software. You know, defect in product liability language has a very specific term. So I suspect that's going to be the center of many of those class actions that you were talking about there. One of the things that I was particularly impressed at watching the government's response to CrowdStrike was the way the National Coordination Mechanism stood up, the way that we had government, key industry segments that were affected in the room being briefed by CrowdStrike. And, you know, I was reflecting back on when WannaCry happened back in 2017, where the government moved very quickly to respond, but it was far less coordinated. And so I think, you know, on the one hand, I was quite impressed by how far we've come.
Yes.
On the other hand, I shared the concern that you have about, well, this could have been a lot worse. You know, if you think 1% of Microsoft computers were affected, as Zoe in our team said, that literally means it could have been 100 times worse, and that's only on the Microsoft computers. So this is not to pick on Microsoft either. There are many other companies that have those types of dependencies. So I think there's lots of really interesting questions for us to be asking, including around national resilience as well. Talking of big companies, another issue that we wanted to touch on was the announcement by ASD that they're going to be working with Amazon Web Services to build what is being described as a top secret cloud for the Australian government. There's a lot of debate at the moment around sovereign tech, around the power of these big tech companies in Australia. Where do you think the limits of Australia's capacity to exert influence, given the size of our markets? But at the same time, how do we mitigate the risks between these public-private partnerships? CrowdStrike is a great example, right? They're one of the most respected cybersecurity companies in the world. On the one hand, I look at what the companies that were affected by the outage and I'm like, well, we know they're the ones that were taking cybersecurity seriously. Yes. It's kind of ironic, right? Exactly. But that's the reality. So how should we be looking at these types of partnerships and ensuring that we're protecting Australia's interests?
Yeah, I think sometimes we underestimate how pivotal Australia can be in these debates. We're a pretty big economy in the global context. We are enormous adopters of digital technologies. So I think we're a market that's taken seriously by the global hyperscalers. So I think we are relevant and effective. We operate, I think, in a good policy middle ground between what I'd call the more laissez-faire approach of the United States and the more regulatory happy approach that we see in the EU. So I think actually we're an important market. We are an influential market, but we are also in a space where we're quite willing to develop regulation to address some of the more challenging issues that actually is quite influential globally. You look at things like the security of critical infrastructure reforms from a few years ago, those have become a model which a lot of countries throughout the world are looking to. It's a model that the United States is just not able to get to. I think it's a model that, in being developed in close consultation with industry, is actually a more sensible regime than we see operating sometimes in the EU context. So I think we generally get the balance right with sensible regulation, co-developed with industry, prioritising digital rights, innovation, but doing so in a way where we're actually acting. We're not just observing kind of the changing nature of cyber issues. So I think we are respected and credible. I think your personal experience has shown in the multilateral system, actually, we are also a really effective player that can bridge the gap between the like-minded powers in Europe and the US, our close friends in this region. I think we are generally really well respected. I think sitting in ANU, it would be remiss of me not to recognise that we have some of the most incredible academic talent when it comes to technologies and cybersecurity in Australia. I think oftentimes the commercial opportunities attract people to bigger markets in the US, but actually some of the cutting edge innovation over the last decades, a lot of it has had an Australian angle or has been led by Australians. So I think we actually bring a lot, and we are operating in a very big global marketplace. It means that we are many of the major global hyperscalers, are not headquartered out of Australia, but I do think we have some advantages there when we try to shape sensible regulation, sensible policy measures where we're not sort of in the pocket of those hyperscalers in the same way that sometimes other jurisdictions face challenges with. So I think we're in a neat sort of middle ground where we are innovators, we're early and widespread adopters of tech. We have an agile regulatory system. We have a parliament that is able to actually move and do things. And we are, I think, seen as credible in the region. So I think Australia should be proud and assertive of its position. I see in my role, I travel a lot internationally, the reception that I get wherever I go, people are just super interested in what we're doing. They're super interested to learn from us. Companies respect us and want to talk to us. We work, in the smaller Pacific islands to the much larger countries in Southeast Asia. So I think we actually bring a lot that's maybe not unique, but certainly brings a particularly Australian approach to these issues.
Brendan, could you talk maybe a little bit about Tech Retreat? Because I think in the context of some of these hyperscalers, it's a really interesting example. And it also kind of goes to the way that your ambassadorial role is perhaps slightly different to other traditional ambassadorial roles.
Yes. Well, this was, it's an incredible thing that my predecessor, Toby Feakin, established, which when he described it to me, the word retreat said sort of spa day and things like that to me. Unfortunately not. It's sitting in sort of conference rooms and things like that. But it's bringing together people who are in the role of a cyber ambassador or technology envoy and sitting down in a less formal environment with major tech innovators. Some of the major leaders of massive firms, people like Brad Smith, have got involved, but also with some of the smaller players. When we did it in San Francisco this year, we had Planet Labs, who are, satellites that basically map the surface of the world numerous times a day. So talking to the major hyperscalers, talking to some of the smaller innovators, bringing together a broad range of countries. One thing that I think we've done really well is bring in countries from Southeast Asia and the Pacific into that forum. I find if you're a senior official in a Pacific Island nation, your prospects of sitting down with the 2 or 3 I see in Meta or going out to the Google campus and meeting with VPs at Google, this is not something you can do. This is something that Australia can make happen for those people, though. So I think they're incredibly appreciative of the opportunity to talk directly with the tech companies. For me, the value is in let's sit down in a situation that feels less formal and let's talk about what we're trying to do. In the sense of we're not turning up with a draft piece of legislation and say, right, here's your chance to comment on this. We're going to pass this in 48 hours. It's saying, we are concerned, say, about security by design in software. Here's the outcome we want to get to, whereby in small to medium enterprises where they are purchasing accounting software, whatever it is, that we're seeing basic cybersecurity built into it. What can we do in government that will shift the needle in the industry? This year, we talked a lot about AI. There's some AI companies who are thinking about security by design. There are a bunch of other AI companies who are just rushing to market with half-baked products, which are creating all manner of issues, many of which quickly get exposed in the press, which is really good. But actually having the conversation to say, we're not the big bad government. We're problem solvers who work for the government. And we want to talk to you about, if we do this, what does that mean for you? Generally speaking, tech companies, I think they operate in a slightly different world. Their incentives are different to what ours are, but no one's trying to do bad stuff. So you can have a constructive conversation to say, if we do this, how will you respond? And they say, well, actually, if you do that, in fact, it won't have the effect you're looking for. It'll have this other effect. And we say, okay, great. Well, what if we do this? And being able to nut through that problem solving directly with the tech industry is really important. I think, again, that's where in Australia, I think we bring a problem solving approach to it. We don't like to use a big stick where a big stick isn't effective. So having those open conversations is really useful. It doesn't mean that we come away from there saying, okay, well, Google would prefer us to do it this way. Let's do it that way. In fact, oftentimes we can come out of those discussions and say, we get this is going to be costly for you. We get this is probably going to make your life difficult, but it is in the interest of the Australian people that we do this. Online safety is a good example where tech companies don't necessarily love what we're doing, but in order to meet the expectations of the Australian community for the safety of their children online, we are going to push the boundaries on that. The Tech Retreat, I think, is a pretty amazing gathering that brings everyone into the same room for relaxed, comfortable conversations that then help us make better policy.
You know, in so many other areas of policy making, you have those kind of conversations happening quite organically. Mm-hmm. And in the tech sector, there is, I think, first of all, there's inherent distrust between government and industry.
Yeah.
And there's a fear of capture, which is a very, that's a very legitimate fear around capture. But also, we're not going to be able to solve these problems by just having industry address them, or just having government address them, or just having academics. And so it's only by bringing the people together that we're actually going to be able to find the solutions that we need. And I think that's a great example of how we do it, and also what we look to do here at the Tech Policy Design Centre as well.
And there are still strains of sort of tech utopianism out there where they reflexively distrust government and think, no, we can solve these problems. I think history has shown us that unregulated, ungoverned technology, surprise, surprise, has some bad impacts. And actually, it's not about government kind of, trying to lock down on things. It's actually trying to say, okay, there's great opportunities here, but we've had some perverse impacts. How do we mitigate those? So there is a way to work together.
Yeah, and it's that concept of enable but not block, and how do you create that environment?
Exactly.
Speaking of tech that is potentially out there and out of control, not that all of it is, artificial intelligence, how much does that centre your role and the work that you do internationally?
Yeah, I think, look, the hype cycle of the last sort of 24 months has meant that you cannot go into any meeting, any discussion, podcast without talking about artificial intelligence. I think an element of it has sort of kind of been diverted into hyperbole. I think, maybe there's financial interests from companies developing new tools to kind of feed that cycle. For me, it is a big feature of everything that we do. However, I like to bring it back to much more sort of practical, constructive, rather than talking about the existential future risk, rather than pretending that AI is going to immediately solve everything for everyone. Let's actually talk about what's useful to do here. I think Australia's approach is pretty sensible in that we're not the first movers when it comes to regulation globally. We're looking at it, we're considering it, we're thinking about what in our existing kind of policy toolkit is already fit for purpose, what needs to be adjusted. I think that will stand us in good stead that we haven't moved super quickly and reflexively. I think artificial intelligence in the tech world, everyone likes to talk about unprecedented and unique. Generally speaking, there is precedence. We have dealt with some of these challenges before. The security by design, the cybersecurity of AI models is not a new problem. This is a piece of software that is designed that can prioritize how it thinks about the data inputs that it has, what level of security is deployed around the software tools. These are problems that have occurred elsewhere and should be prioritized by the AI industry as well. I think some of the risks of data bias and things like that, surprise, surprise, some of the LLMs that have been released come up with some perverse stuff, which if you test and validate, if you go through a quality assurance process, you can mitigate some of these things. So I think there are many lessons that we've learned in other elements of software, in other elements of public policy that can be applied here. The idea that AI is totally new and divorced from anything we've done in the past, I think is completely false. I think there's some really interesting angles for us here. There is a perception from developing countries in our region that AI is yet another tool developed by Western countries for Western countries that will not see benefits that flow to the rest of the world. I think there's a real risk of that happening. In this region, say in the Pacific, say in some of your poorer Southeast Asian nations, there is far less digital data to feed into models. There are the intractable problems that are being experienced are not necessarily the ones that the industry is prioritizing in solving. I think Australia can bring a perspective of, well, let's help to tie this to our development agenda. So if we are supporting digital connectivity through subsea cables, through telecommunications in the region, that helps to build better digital data collection. That helps to feed models that are more applicable, appropriate for this region. At the same time, we can help to build regulatory approaches that think about the high risks and the downsides, but also don't squeeze so much that you actually miss out on the opportunities. That's where I think is a more interesting part of the conversation to take. I think through the Global Digital Compact at the UN this year, that's an opportunity to say, well, how can we actually use AI tools for good? I think at this point we're seeing great productivity benefits in the use of AI tools. Those are all really good. The exciting stuff is when we start to solve healthcare problems in the developing world and things like that. So I think that's where we would love to push the conversation in this region. I do think there are some potential downside risks to how much energy and attention is on AI. And one of those that I'll call out is the idea that the state-based United Nations system should be able to have a much stronger governance role in the development of AI tools brings a lot of risks. As you know, multi-stakeholderism is a challenge in the UN system. We need to remember the UN is dominated by states. There are states with authoritarian agendas that use the UN very effectively. I think we need to be very careful about establishing mechanisms through the UN system that have too much of a role in governing AI. This is an area where industry, digital rights stakeholders, the development community all need to have a voice, and we need to find forums and ways that they are all included in that governance. I think UN anchored bodies are not always the best way to do that.
I think the point you make about artificial intelligence for development purposes is also really important. I think it's often lost. I think the fact that this is not an area necessarily of focus for the big companies that developing countries in our region, however, are looking to artificial intelligence to help them gain efficiencies to feed their populations, to educate their people. Mm-hmm. And if Australia isn't stepping up and into that space, then China certainly will be. And I think it's a really important dimension. Yep. So perhaps, Brendan, if we can just finish the pod by talking a little bit about your role in overseeing Australia's cyber cooperation program in the region and maybe some examples of the types of programs that you do, because it just demonstrates the breadth from the sort of geostrategic focus that you have to the attribution types of work, the UN multilateral system. But the cyber cooperation program is a really big and important pillar of that work.
It's been in operation for several years now. I think has achieved some incredible things. We were fortunate with the release of the new cyber strategy last year to have an injection of additional funding towards our capacity building work. There's a couple of headlines where I think we've done some really good things. The first one is through the cyber strategy last year, embedding what we're calling the Cyber Rapid program, which is something we've done on an ad hoc responsive way. Now we have a formal program around it. Effectively, what it is when a cyber incident affects a country in the Pacific, shuts down a government service, shuts down a bank, telecommunications service, we can deploy foreign affairs officials with industry partners, get them on the ground, provide support immediately, so in the hours when an incident becomes clear, but get people on the ground within a day or so to get in the SOC or the CERT or just wherever the network is being managed, and actually have people sitting side by side with the Pacific governments on the ground and to remediate the incident. Unfortunately, this is something we're probably using more frequently than I would hope because there are these disruptive incidents happening really regularly throughout the Pacific. So we, at the moment, we have 3 teams deployed in the region who are actually doing remediation as we speak. Disruption of essential services. This is something we all need surge support when these incidents happen. Australia does. Pacific Islands frequently have less capacity to respond to an incident, so we are getting people on the ground to help out. We're not just reacting though. Other parts of our program look at how we can build the capacity of those countries to be able to better prevent incidents. Sometimes that means upgrading tech. That can mean buying new servers. If your government system is operating off a data center or servers that haven't been patched in a long time, the only way to make yourself less vulnerable is to upgrade. That means we need to actually buy kit, and that is a kind of really tangible thing that we do in the region. In Southeast Asia, we've done a lot to build up digital forensics teams in policing agencies. That means using the AFP to train people. It means buying digital forensics equipment. We've helped many countries in the region develop cybersecurity acts or legal regimes that deal with cybercrime, that deal with online safety issues. So deal with critical infrastructure protection, taking some of the lessons that we've learned here, working with partners like ANU to actually develop new strategies and new legislation. ANU's been a great partner for us in running cyber boot camps, where we bring senior government officials from across Southeast Asia and the Pacific and expose them to the cutting edge of thinking about cyber and technology security issues. It's a really reputable, valued program in the region. I'm really proud of what it's managed to achieve over several years now, and we have seen it deliver dividends for many countries in the region. We've seen laws operate. In Fiji, we saw the first use of their cybercrime legislation in picking up someone who was grooming a child using online tools. We've seen certs developed in a number of places in the Pacific which have dealt with incidents. We're running support for telecommunications deployment in places like Vietnam. So I think it's an incredibly practical project which the Australian government should be proud of. I think supporting the digital development of this region is a major foreign policy goal for us, but we want it done in a secure and safe way. And I think this program is one of the most effective ways we've done that.
Thank you so much for your time today, Brendan. It's been a real tour of your mandate and the work that you and your team do, which I know is relentless. So thank you for what you do. Thank you to your team. And thanks for being with us here at Tech Mirror.
Thanks so much, Johanna. And I do want to shout out to your incredible history working for DFAT and particularly your multilat work, but also the incredible school you've built here in the Tech Policy Design Centre. I think genuinely doing some world-leading, nation-leading work on better technology policy design. So well done to you.
Thanks, Brendan. Tech Mirror is a podcast of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. This episode was recorded on Ngunnawal lands with sound engineering by ANU Studio. Amy Denmead provided invaluable research support. Post-production is by Martin Franklin from East Coast Studio. Thanks for listening. Get in touch and get involved.